Good evening, everyone, and a warm welcome to our first School of Governance, Law and Society research seminar of this semester. And today we are going to talk about wicked problems from various angles, and we will be doing this with my good colleagues Georg Sootla, who is professor of public policy in our school, and Benjamin Klasche, who is a doctoral candidate of government and politics in our school, and I am Peeter, professor of political theory, and also the kind of like a host for today's event, being the head of the research collegium. And I will start by sharing my screen this moment. Here we go. Okay, now it's full screen, I hope. Okay, what we are talking about here is ongoing work in progress, so to speak, a book that we hope to submit to the publishing house of Palgrave Macmillan, to the series of Palgrave Studies in Relational Sociology, and our working title is From Governance Failure to Failure Governance, a relational turn in governing wicked problems. And this is, as a way of providing some background, this is kind of like one of the major publication related to the project I have been leading for the past 4 years, personal research funding from the Estonian Research Council, with the title A Relational Approach to Governing Wicked Problems. Just a reminder of how this project started. This is from 2016, when it was composed, this proposal, and you can see that there are various wicked problems at the time: community safety, local government autonomy, and the rapidly changing migration crisis. And now, of course, 5 years later, we're all talking about COVID-19, more or less. But still, the framework we have been trying to develop and articulate is quite pertinent. And one thing I wanted to point out, that this is from the Estonian Research Information Center, and it's sort of like an upside down world for me. The annotation in English is actually in Estonian, and the annotation, which is supposed to be in Estonian, is actually in English, and this is how it looks like in the database. So it's sort of like a touch of fate that we are not talking about governance failure, which is a common term, but failure governance. And by the way, a curious fact is that when you use Google Scholar, if you put in failure governance, all you get is governance failure, more or less. So Google doesn't have this curious order of words. It doesn't make sense of it very well yet. And we try to point out that this, well, we could say from the very beginning that failure governance for us is something very positive, in a way, positive way to handle wicked problems. Governance failure is usually very widely discussed: why states fail, markets fail, networks fail, and so on. But okay, as a way of theoretical background, our project stems from what has been referred to as relational sociology, which is more or less equivalent but not equal. That's why I use this three-line equivalent sign to process relational sociology, or as it's sometimes also referred to as transactional sociology. Here, I want to point out to some very important historical roots. One of the main sources that has been inspired in recent decades, relational sociology movement, is actually quite old. Published originally in the 1940s, 1949, by John Dewey, one of the greatest pragmatist philosopher of science and basically everything, and Arthur Bentley, his close collaborator. In the meantime, there has been, in 2018, the Belgrave Handbook of Relational Sociology was published, edited by the late Francois de Peltoux. He passed away, unfortunately, in 2018. But in between, we can say that a very major source of inspiration comes from Mustafa Emir Bayer in one of the most influential sociology journals, American Journal of Sociology, already almost 25 years ago. A manifesto for relational sociology, and he explicitly takes Dewey and Bentley's distinction as his starting point, to which we come in a minute. I also mentioned a very recent book from 2019 dedicated to this notion of transaction, where the phrase relational transactional sociology comes from, edited by Christian Morgner. It was actually supposed to be edited by Francois de Peltoux, but unfortunately he passed away during the process almost last. I'm also pointing to even more recent book introducing relational political analysis, political semiotics as a theory and method, which we published last September with a good colleague and friend Andreas Wenzel from the University of Tartu. And the freshest material I can point is a forthcoming issue of Digitum, a relational perspective on cultural society, which has a special section and issue dedicated to the work of Francois de Peltoux, who is a major author informing our discussion here today as well. Okay, now the aim of the book is to bring relational sociology to bear on what we could call relational governance. What would process relational governance, or what we could call or to call in the book transactive governance look like? This is sort of like a conceptual leap from the ontological, the world how it is or how we can conceive of it, to the normative, how should we organize our world, our governance. And this hasn't been taken thus far, although normative discussions abound, also ontological discussions are very extensive, but the link between the two. What does it mean to govern from the relational point of view? And I briefly fill you in about the very basics of the ontological part, the research-related part of relational sociology. And here the distinction that Dewey and Bentley introduce in their book, and that has been traveling through many publications later, is between what they call self-action, interaction, and transaction, as three different worldviews of basically, we could say everything, but we are talking about in the social world, in the context of the social world. So let's start with self-action. if it's not otherwise indicated, these are excerpts from the book or manuscript. So self-action, this is a worldview indicating that the prefix self indicates that it refers to kind of like an action that is taken up by individual entities that are presumed to be acting under their own powers. This is a world of independent, you know, molecules, actors, structures, whatever. And when we analyze social processes from that point of view, basically we reduce those processes or problems to their instigators. We're looking for the persons, institutions, states, or other entities responsible for them. Now, interaction. As the prefix inter indicates, this is an action that takes place between between or among entities that are themselves fully constituted. Basically, this is a worldview, as Dewey and Bentley point out, where thing is balanced against thing in a causal interconnection. So basically, if you study social processes from that point of view, we are reifying processes as entities. Reification means you treat a relation, a process as a kind of thing. Processes are like things between or among other things. Now, transaction, as the prefix trans indicates, is sort of like an action that transcends the entities which are constituted within this action. So, in a way, we could say from a transactional worldview, the parts cannot be what they are outside the relations they have with the whole, with each other. They are constituted within action. This is kind of like a very basic approximation of the idea, but I'm also putting here a quote from Dewey and Bentley themselves, which is probably frightening, but actually the idea is quite simple. Systems of description and naming are employed to deal with aspects and phases of action without final attribution to elements or other presumptively detachable or independent entities, essences or realities, and without isolation of presumptively detachable relations from such detachable elements. So basically two things here. All our conceptual scheme systems of descriptions are preliminary, constantly changing. We are not presuming that they grasp some sort of essences of the world. And we, secondly, don't presume that essences or entities, are understandable outside the relations or detachable from those relations they are immersed in. So, and this basically means that even if we are talking about entities and their relations, but in actual, we should bear in mind that we should treat them as unfolding, ongoing processes in which it makes no sense to envision those elements apart from the flows within which they are involved, and vice versa, to use Mustafa Emir Bayer's words. And to quote myself, which we use also in the book, we are talking about transactional perspective when we presume something to be a relation that exists in practice and whose elements can be considered separately, but not as being separate. So the latter, separately, but not as being separate figure, comes from a very important relational sociologist, Norbert Elias, which I've been using in various places. Now, this is an ontological perspective, how to understand social processes, how to understand social action, three different perspectives. We either reduce process as as something owned by their instigators, or something as being reified as some sort of separate thing, or when it comes to transactional perspective, we treat a process as a constitutive process that is not reducible to either elements or the relations only. The mutual constitution is very important. So this was the ontological part of the perspective. Now we move to the normative one. Here, I point out that when we are talking about normative perspective, we are talking about transactive, like interactive, transactive, self-active forms of governance to mark the difference between ontological and normative perspectives. Now, here two things need to be clarified. What's the difference between simple, complex, and wicked problems? And as we argue also, we can distinguish the fourth category of problems, which we call deproblematized problems, problems that have been actually solved by displacing their solution somewhere else. And the second thing that needs to be clarified is the distinction, as I mentioned, between self-active, interactive, and transactive governance. So very simply put, different forms of problems. If we're talking about simple problems like issuing ID cards or whatever governance problems, routine governance problems, there is an agreement over the definition of the problem and the solution to the problem. But when we are talking about complex problems, we might have an agreement on the definition of the problem, but usually we have quite heated disagreements about how to solve it or how to move forward. And they need not only specialists, as in case of simple problems, but also a cooperation between specialists. Wicked problems are characterized by an all-encompassing disagreement. There's no definition of the problem that everybody would agree on, and there is no agreement on a solution that everybody would agree on. And the definitions are constantly changing. The stakeholders are constantly changing as well. They might come in, go out. So the disagreement is overwhelming, let's say. This is a very schematic presentation at the moment. And logically, there's a fourth category of problems in which there is a disagreement of the definition of problem. We don't seem to know what's going on, but at the same time, we have an agreement on what to do. This is a very common situation in politics. We often have ready-made kind of ideological, almost ritual responses to whatever societal problems like balanced budget or whatever invisible hand can do the trick, or more bureaucracy or more hierarchy, more rules, whatever, even if we don't understand the problem at hand. And so this is what we call in the book deproblematized problems. Now, deproblematization can take various forms. We analyze in our previous book on political semiotics, various communicative techniques for deproblematizing problems and so on. But what I wanted to point out about wicked problems is that this disagreement or agreement is not the only aspect of it. It is, as it is often pointed out, that some disagreements might be quite heated, but this doesn't necessarily mean that we have a wicked problem here. So it's not about only the cognition or perception of the problem, but the complexity and uncertainty has to be involved as well. And this is the thing that, you know, both the solution and the problem are mutually constitutive and changing all the time. So this points to the topic that has been often discussed in complexity theory, for instance, which presumes that things are not reducible to the sum of their parts, or complex systems are in a way always on the move, mutating from one phase into another. So the distinction between different forms of governance we want to come up with in the end can be summarized with this kind of table where we distinguish between self-active, interactive, and transactive governance. Self-active governance might have the hierarchical, state-oriented, command-oriented form, but it also can have a invisible hand kind of approach, market kind of approach. We argue that these kinds of approaches are quite well suited for simple problems, so solving simple problems, but it gets more complicated with complex problems for which often governance in a narrow sense that is often related to network has been proposed. Of course, a network can fail too. It might end up being a talking shop with no results. What we propose suitable for wicked problems is what we refer to as transactive governance, which would be based on this processual understanding of the world, and then also processual organization, which would be oriented not to the solution of the problem, but to the failure of governance, or which would have failure as kind of like a starting point, not some curious, unexpected occurrence. And very often, as I said, actually, governance involves deproblematization, which can take various forms, including market, hierarchy, network. This is basically treating wicked problems as if they were simple or complex problems. A couple of words before I move to the examples. What we call transactive governance is what we have a more figurative name for it, failure governance. The idea actually is that this is a form of governance that would kind of hypertrophy the attitude of problematization, problematizing issues instead of trying to have a safe ground for them. Here we take our lead, among others, but very importantly from Bob Jessop's ideas about meta-governance and the various principles or ethos of meta-governance. He distinguished between requisite variety, or the deliberate cultivation of flexible repertoire of responses, which adds some flexibility in the face of failure, even if it's in a way brings in slack or waste. It's not economically always efficient to have various approaches, various scenarios at the table. But at the same time, it also provides major sources of flexibility in the face of failure. In addition, he talks about reflexive orientation. Reflexive observer cannot fully understand what she's observing and must therefore make contingency plans for unexpected events. So there's a kind of like a questioning, kind of always questioning the assumptions kind of approach, in that sense, reflexive orientation. And also what he refers to as self-reflexive irony. which comes from the irony here involved here comes from originally from Richard Rorty, but he talks about public irony. So it's in a way pessimism of the intelligence, but optimism of the will. So ironist accepts that he's in a way, she or he is in a way involved in distorting reality, but is always aware of that. So that she's simplifying complex issues into manageable wholes, but is never presuming that she has the entire grasp of the entire reality involved. So this is also a very highly discussed, widely discussed issue in complexity theory. So basically those three principles or ethicists, requisite variety, reflexive orientation, and self-reflexive irony, come down to the slogan: if one is likely to fail, one can at least choose one's preferred form of failure. So this is from Jessup again. Now, this is kind of like a very briefly a theoretical input. I will just indicate a couple of examples that we will be discussing in the book at great length, but here we only indicate the directions. So failure governance. So I'm not sure whether you know who this guy is, but if you suspect that he's the happiest guy in the world, you're not that wrong. But actually, his name is very memorable, Chen, who is actually the vice president, former vice president of Taiwan. And we are illustrating there the Republic of China or Taiwan's approach as an example of failure governance. Also, I point out that Chen is a very eminent medical scholar, graduated in Johns Hopkins in epidemiology and so on. But this is only part of the success story, I suspect. So what I very briefly point out that this requisite variety and then the reflexive orientation and so on. This is actually a slide I stole from Chen himself. Here he points out rapid mobilization, swift decision-making, thorough implementation, coordinated resource distribution, transparent information, advanced technology. I personally would highlight, based on my research thus far, that this is transparency. Taiwanese government is almost obsessed with transparency. Very detailed briefings, very constant information changing. But another thing, which is also, of course, important for reflexive orientation and we could even say self-reflexive irony. But I want to point out to one journal article. This is a very eminent journal with the name in Estonian, of course, it sounds very well, Jama, which in Estonian means bullshit, but Journal of American Medical Association pointed out already in March 2020 that for the past 5 weeks, since January, they have already implemented a list of 124 action items. We can point out that they started their response to COVID-19 already on December 31, roughly, 2019. And this article points out, among others, actions on border control, travel restrictions, and case finding, actions on resource allocation, various subcategories, and also actions on communications and politics. And here you can probably see some curious stuff already in January 22nd. There's a government announced that the spread of fake news on epidemic can be fined up to 3 million Taiwanese new dollars, which is about $100,000 US. And this is very different. The transparency on one hand, democratic, sometimes very rough kind of fines, very varying array of measures already in a very early phase of containing or responding to COVID-19 crisis. So results are incredible. Taiwan is about 24 million people. They have total registered cases of less than 1,000 and only 9 deaths. And their economy, among other things, is even growing. Not only has it not declined, but it's even growing. So we can say that this is kind of like very briefly, but an example of failure governance. Here we can see Tsai Ing-wen, the president of Taiwan, and also Jen, former vice president. Now, as a way of concluding, a very different picture. If we, you probably, some of you know, but most of you probably know the guy in the middle, but the gentleman in the right is none other than Anthony Fauci, very eminent, even way more highly cited than Jen, medical scientist, and the lady in the left is Deborah Birx. Both are members of the White House coronavirus task force that was put in motion in very late January last year. And the picture is kind of like an iconic summary of that. Very briefly, but skipping hundreds of details, 2 aspects I would want to bring out when it comes to governance failure in the case of the US. Trump's politics of deproblematization and what we can refer to as institutional deproblematization of the United States. So when it comes to first, I'm just illustrating a very good illustration was found in media. So here's the timeline, January 22nd. Basically, deproblematization means that you are displacing the problem. You are you are either saying or using other means of communication that this problem is actually contained. There is no problem. So on January 22, when there was only 1 registered case, and well, February 10 looks like by April, you know, in theory, when it gets a little warmer, it miraculously goes away. So we can see here in the right the number of cases. Even in March, he was talking about the fake news media, and the partner Democratic Party is doing everything within its semi-considerable power to inflame the coronavirus situation. And of course, later you can see, because the virus is spreading exponentially, you can get in weeks from the previous picture to the current one, and so on and so on. And institutional deproblematization, what has been referred to as institutional silos, the non-communication between different regulating institutions and so on, regulatory hurdles, for instance, when there was actually available, the coronavirus tests were available, very difficult where it was to implement them or distribute them, among other things, by the fragmented authority among national and state levels, and the hollowing out of the healthcare institutions. There are various aspects, including the competitive and highly privatized healthcare institutions in the United States. So this is, and the results you probably know, there are like almost 30 million cases and almost 500,000 steps. So here I would stop with my presentation, and I went a little bit over time, but hopefully Georg can now chime in. I will stop my share screen. So Georg, please.
Me ei kuule.
Are you? Georg, is your microphone on? No, it's not.
I should do that sequentially.
Okay.
Now it's
Share
okay.
Screen and put your. Okay, now we can see.
You see, then I would. It's okay. You see, my friend. I would demonstrate you how the failure governance problem emerged in the policy sciences and policy analysis. And I would be a bit paradoxical. I would demonstrate how positivist approach, a substantialist approach, actually moved towards the interactional way of understanding reality. And in that way, we can see today that we have two different ontological paradigms, which are very closely attending the wicked problems issue. But I cannot. Okay. Okay, the starting points at the emerging of policy science, we see the inclination to make policy as a great plan and to subordinate policy analysis to the scientific exact analysis, and to introduce the mechanisms which gives full authority and full discretion to the rational, comprehensive rational actors. And the classical, hence is coming classical understanding that policy, the aim of policy is finding the best solution to problems. It means to make decisions. Then very soon, very soon see that positivist approach to the policy analysis is departing from this normative approach to the rational actor. And first shift was linked with the names of Herbert Simon and Charles Lindblom, who argued and who demonstrated that human cognitive capacities are too limited to make rational policy choices. And human capacities are not appropriate to make the best choices and best balances. And then if we, from the start, the mission of policy was considered and speaking truth to powers, then very soon Wildavsky reformulated that policy analysis is an art and craft. And then some decades later, Charles Lindblom, Schoen, Hoppe, they defined the mission of policy analysis and policy making and to making sense together. The sense-making concept is becoming also central in organizational theory. The second shift, we see the shift from the ontology of order, ontology of substantial order, to the ontology of chaos, uncertainty and contingency. It means that positivist science of policy analysis started to consider the context of the policy making as chaotic, uncertain, ambiguous, And hence we have several shifts and several big names, starting from Graham Allison, Kubian Missile crisis, garbage can decision-making style, John Kington. Then all those people were empirical behaviorists. They are completely working on the level of facts, variables, and so on. But they are already studying contingency, uncertainty. And what is very important, the shift on process relational approach in Europe has not come yet. It was a shift initiated by Bergson and Whitehead. And they are coming to Europe. Process relational approach to policy analysis is coming via France. We see this later. The shift 3, the understanding that the main action of policy analysis and policy making is done at an official level. And there is a split of official and unofficial policy. It means that the type of iceberg is the official policy, which we are studying and which is demonstrative, and unofficial policy or policy communities are the part where the policy is made actually. And this make policy making is very, very contingent, very chaotic. And we have, from here, we have policy network theories. It means that policy is not a kind of hierarchical decision making, but it is a kind of interactive policy making in network. And there are a lot of different theories, policy streams, rational choice theories, new institutional economics, by the way. It is very much to promoting that advocacy coalition framework and so on. Fourth shift is a shift from policy substance to the design of policy arenas. It means that researchers and politicians are starting to understand that the main link in successful policy is not the policy program, but the main link is the preparation and design of arenas in which not only decisions are made, but these decisions are also implemented via policy community. And also these names, Kickert, Klein, Koppenian, Scharpf, Fritz Scharpf, they all are representing empirical behaviorism. And shift 5, it is a shift from the conception of policy stages. It means that policy process is a linear sequence of stages toward iterative and agile policy making. Agile policy making, by the way, is coming from software development theory, practice. It means that this policy is made moving iteratively forth and back. And agile, it means that you are adapting your policy purposes and problem definitions within all the process of policy making. And this is actually the definition of wicked problems. We are understanding the problem when we coming to the end. And you can imagine software development, then you can get appropriate software via agile software development. And even at the end, you can understand, did you choose correct way? And this shift actually erodes the Estonian input-output model, because Estonian model of input, policy input and policy output presumed that there is a big time difference between political input to the government and then output from the government within several years, several months. This theory and this understanding presume that policy inputs outputs should be made permanently. You cannot build up the top-down policy. It should be permanently iterating. And the last trend I would emphasize is the trend in the positivist policy analysis to accept the concept which are actually concepts that are developed in the constructivism: policy frames, policy learning, practical reasoning, practical reason, policy argumentation, policy narratives. And here, finally, they finalized in the conception of interactive policy making, which actually started from Allison. But the last example is Charles Winship. It is a positivist methodologist who defined policy as puzzle solving, at putting together puzzles. It means that that policy is actually very how to say, spontaneous and very how to say, practical process of finding practical solutions. And I like very much his sentence that you don't know where you are going, but you actually get there. It is positivist definition of policy making and policy analysis. Then I put together here some table, which I cannot fully comment, but I made some kind of conceptual comparison of interactive policy making and transactive policy. I make some examples and then finalizing. The policy purpose. The positivist understanding still is that we should solve the problem. The transactive policy understanding on transactionalists is that policy we are dealing not with problems, but we are dealing with problem situation. Our task is to understand what is happening, and we should unpack and solve this problem situation. It means that this is a very much iterative and agile policy making, but in transactive fashion. Then policy outcome. Interactive policy outcome is trying to reach consensus, the area of interest, intersection of interests, but transactional policy is trying to develop compatible patterns when the differences, conflict, hostility, maybe policy actors are remaining, but you can organize those people in the context when they are starting to prefer joint action, not to look on differences, not to look on conflicts, but from other side to look on opportunities. And this, the third is actors behavior. In transactional policy, we speak about actors gaming. Strategic actors are gaming, it takes time. And what makes this policy, interactive policy, closer to the transactional policy is that they are not doing as usually ad hoc decision, but they are using packet deals. It means that they are distributing risks in long time, but these are very much strategic game in the long-term perspective. Transactional policy actually, because they don't know what is a problem, how to solve them, they are trying to develop practical patterns of transactions and to open up different problem situation, different patterns, different issues. And what this is a sentence of Winship. I don't know where I'm going, but I expect that I am going there. Then there are, and the last, what is, I will add to the Peter's the presentations. The policy strategy is to reach balances, predictability, and control over processes, to reduce uncertainty. What are making transactional policymakers? They are adapting to contingency. They are allowing to happen things and then to intervene very selectively and in very timely moments. And when we are comparing European culture and Chinese culture, we can tell that European culture is very much, so to say, inclined to the interactive policy style. The selfish dominating actor. Then Chinese, Taiwan, they are looking for processes. This is a very process-based culture, and they are not intervening deliberatively without sufficient reason. And for that reason, they can, how to say, direct this process to directions which are unfolding, but you can, how to say, use this process and at least predict what is happening. And the last 2 minutes, what is a key for policy analysis, transactional policy analysis is a process relational ontology. And I am working with Alfred Whitehead, Gilles Deleuze, John Law, Bruno Latour. Those people are from natural sciences mostly. They are introducing a process relational approach based on very much on the ideas of relativity theory and quantum physics. The second is that wicked problems approach and transactional approach are using not usual concept of complexity, what I call romantic or extensive, but they are using intensive, or as Deleuze is defining Baroque concept of complexity. And it is very much echoing with the Levi-Strauss bricolage understanding. And we, Gilles, and this is actually the concept of complexity, which look the complexity in the micro level and how this complexity is unfolding. And Gilles Deleuze has especially book The Fold, when he analyzing unfolding process, rhizome process, and so on. And what should be emphasized that this approach of complexity is not on hierarchical way of systems, but on flat systems, flat ontology. And for that reason, they are able to control, and they are looking for controlling the situation via macro space. And finally, this is a shift in the transactional theory from to relational concept of praxis. And there are two names, at least, Pierre Bourdieu and Schatzky. Okay, don't remind Schatzky. They have developed a concept of practice, which is pictured in this space. The above is a interactional understanding of praxis, context, knowledge. It means that we have knowledge, we have context, and then practice is, which is, how to say, in practice, we are applying knowledge in context. But in relational process relational approach, they are understanding vice versa, that practice is actually constituting knowledge and context simultaneously. And this is some kind of mechanism of opening up or unfolding or constituting our knowledge, our practice, our agency. Thank you. Well, this was my three main points concerning the governing contingency and failure.
Thank you very much, Georg. And now, Ben, the floor is yours.
Yes. Okay, I can share now. So I guess you can all see this. So thanks, Peter, Georg. So I'm going back to the examples now. I will look at Germany in a similar way that Peter looked at the United States and Taiwan, and see if we can actually take some lessons from here as well. And then I will jump to our, or at least part of our conclusion of the book, where we're now looking ahead to the ever-present wicked problem, the climate crisis, and maybe we can take some lessons from our cases here, successes and failures, and see what we could actually be doing about the climate crisis in the future. But this is kind of the conclusion attempt of our book. So looking at Germany, I thought it might be useful to remember you of these meta-governance principles that Peter briefly talked about. But I don't want to actually go into these quotes from Jessup, but maybe think with you, this is how I interpret these. So how meta-governance looks kind of like in practice when somebody's actually doing politics. So requisite variety, I would interpret as quick adaptation of policies involving non-policy experts, so scientists, when it comes to coronavirus. Using non-traditional channels of communication, so many different flexible outcomes. Social media especially was used successfully in Germany, but also this institutional problematization, so capacity building in the healthcare system, in bureaucratic apparatuses that are going to be helpful later on dealing with the problems. If we look to reflexive orientation, I interpret this as the preparation for failure as the only outcome. So this has to be always in the policymaker's mind. This means as soon as I notice a policy becomes unsuccessful, I need to kind of change course and not double down and say it will be better at the end, like Donald Trump's strategy. Just believe it's going to go away, and he doubles down when he sees it doesn't work. That's exactly what you shouldn't do. Also involvement of experts, something that I can see here too. And then the third one, self-reflexive irony, I interpret as the leaders need to acknowledge what they're actually looking at. So if I'm looking at a wicked problem that I cannot solve, I need to say this. I need to say this is going to be very hard to deal with, and I don't even know how to deal with it. That again then leads back to bringing in experts, changing policies swiftly. So I hope I can show some examples of Germany where this is happening. But first, I thought I needed to think about this before I gave this presentation, whether we can actually talk about Germany as a success. Now, in comparison to Taiwan, it certainly is not, but no country would be considered. So I was kind of collecting some data and at least comparing Germany with the other big European countries. And if you look especially at the cases per million and the deaths per million inhabitants, Germany's numbers are quite a lot better actually than France, Italy, UK and Spain. And additionally here, I would like to highlight also Germany's population density, which is very high. Only the UK has a higher one among these countries. So higher population density should actually mean that the virus spreads easier and has more cases, more deaths, which Germany, it seems to still came out of it quite, successfully. Though there's still issues, there's still lots of cases every day. There's mental issues. The economic growth is negative, though not as bad as in the other countries. So for now, my conclusion is that it is somewhat of a success, and we can kind of think about it this way. So where do we find markers for this success? I would say we have to start with the German leadership. Now we can start with Merkel, the person, Chancellor Merkel. I read somewhere it's actually positive that she's a woman. Also in Taiwan, we see the leader is a woman, mostly because she's not a man who tends to do self-active kind of governance like we see from Trump or Boris Johnson. But we also need to point out in Merkel's case that she is a scientist by training. So she is kind of open to talking to experts. She understands the scientific method. She understands that results of the scientific method might change, very similar to the Taiwan case and the example of the vice president there. And at last, actually, or finally, she is not going to stay in office. I think this is also something we need to mention, that she wasn't out for popularity, but for what is kind of best for the population. At least I will go there for now and say so. Here's some quotes of her plan. She set out on March 18th. So when she stood in front of the nation and told we're now going to introduce a lockdown. This is serious, she says. Please take this seriously. This is the worst thing that happened since the Second World War to our country. So kind of leading it back to the self-reflexive irony, saying what it is. This is not something easy we can deal with. The government will constantly reassess what we're doing. We need to be making adjustments based on developments. So here we see a lot of requisite variety, a reflexive orientation. The last quote I want to show you, we are a democracy. We thrive not because we are forced to do something, but because we share knowledge, encourage active participation. So requisite variety, bringing in a lot of non-policy actors. Also this idea of transparency that Peter was mentioning in the Taiwan case kind of rings through here. Then Germany also has been called, at least by many media outlets, successful due to the embracement of the scientific community. Here we see a picture of the kind of head consultant, Professor Drosten, the head of the virology department of the Berliner Charity Hospital. he happened to be the leading virologist in the world. So this, of course, is something we cannot ignore when we talk about this. He dealt a lot with the SARS epidemic in 2005. So he has quite some experience in all of this. But again, going back to Merkel, she says there's ongoing consultations with the specialist, with the virologist. So requisite variety once more. Professor Drosten also produced a extremely popular podcast where he gave everyday updates, explained what's behind the science that leads to the measures that the people are living through. YouTube channels have been used. A lot of science communication really has been brought forward. Again, requisite variety. And then we have Germans that understand what's going on and actually trust more into the problem. We also have this aspect of institutional problematization. So in the case of the United States, Peter was talking about deproblematization. So maybe the example of the healthcare system, to move it from the political sphere to the private sphere. So it's the job of the citizens to deal with it. This has not been the case in Germany's in Germany's healthcare system, where it stayed in the public sphere. Also, the administrative capability building, this kind of famous German bureaucracy that is large and you can't, hard to use for things, actually became useful out of a sudden. So we have this institutional problematization, I would call, in the German case. So in somewhat of a quick conclusion, the coronavirus crisis has been viewed as an extraordinary item, not just as something else added on the plate of the policymakers. So very quickly we realized that you cannot use the regular tools, these tools of interactive governance, Georg just introduced, or self-active governance even. Swift policy changes were made when there was failure, something wasn't working, quickly changed to a new kind of direction. Non-political experts like Professor Drosten played a large role. Generally, there was even kind of a virologist fan club going on in Germany. So they really played a big role in the public role in the decision making. And at last, the population was very clearly involved, where Merkel says it's kind of on you and we need you to work with us. Now, don't mistake this for deproblematization. So taking what is actually part of the public sphere, so of the political sphere, so the job of the politicians, and putting it on the people. But we need to work together on this to kind of get this solved. Somewhat the German case. Now, if I would take some lessons from this and look at climate crisis governments or climate governance in general. First, when I look at it, I see everything has been done exactly the opposite way. So it has been just considered another policy agenda item. We need to do economic policy. We also need to be doing some climate policy, educational policy. It's just one of the back of the things we need to do. So in this setting, we deployed regular government tools of interactive governance. So when we look at the Kyoto Protocol, which is probably the most prominent policy initiative, it was just, we are trading some carbon with each other, have some multilateral agreements. This is like a typical tool in the government box, but it didn't work. Policies have not swiftly changed when we saw that they're not working. So we are in these 10-year plans all the time. We see they're failing, but we're sitting them through till the end. We're waiting, and then maybe we make a new plan. So no adjustments on the fly, not admitting that we failed and we need something new. Experts barely played a role in making these decisions. At least I haven't really heard of it. And at last, they have been deproblematized to the private public sphere. So instead of governments taking kind of the responsibility in making climate governance an issue of the political sphere, they're saying it's the responsibility of private citizens, of companies, to make kind of sustainable and responsible decisions. So it's a deproblematization to the other sector, where it actually shouldn't be. Now, current approaches in climate governance have been kind of reacted to this by taking the state completely out of the equation. So we're looking at the role of individuals, of NGOs, of citizens. We're trying to get kind of out of this hierarchical power structure and introduce transnational climate governance, so something that happens outside of the state, beyond the state, something like this, something that is just not the state. That is kind of the answer in a lot of the current theorizing on climate governance. But we have, so far it's just me, the idea that we can bring the state back in when we embrace our ideas of failure governments. So the state has to play an important role here. I don't see a way that transnational movements will actually have an effect on the climate if the states, which play the biggest role in the international system, do not chime in. So we need to kind of embrace everything we just heard about what Germany is doing, what Taiwan was doing. So treat the climate crisis as an extraordinary policy agenda item. This is an emergency. This is a crisis. This is not just another, something you have to do Tuesday afternoon, but this is what you should be dealing with all the time, nonstop. We have to kind of accept that the current policy tools are not working for it. So we need to move from doing everyday policy with our tools to this policy ethos of contingency, of expecting failure and readjusting when failure happens. We need to constantly problematize this problem. So we need to get it kind of back from the public and private sphere to the political sphere, constantly problematization via base education, grassroots movements, new communication pathways. We need to bring the experts in, talk to the climate scientists and take them seriously and hear what they are saying. And then when failure occurs, swift policy adaptation, swift changes, and then that's our suggestions coming from our current cases. So thank you. That's from me.
Okay.
Thank you very much, Benjamin. So now I open the floor for questions and comments, and we try to both kind of keep track on maybe you could use this raise hand function at the left, at the right of your screen to notify if you want to comment a question. Or should we formalize it? Be so formal? It's like 30 people. Or we can. So questions and comments.
Sorry, I don't have this hand feature. Let me here. I would like to address a question to Benjamin. You put together in your presentation two pretty different topics of COVID reaction and climate change. I think that we will not argue in a sense that COVID is like having an pretty awful disease spreading in us is a natural state of our being, but coming to the climate, according to the climatologist, we are currently in the ice age. What has made you to take the sort of assumption that the ice age is a normal state of the world and needs to be preserved?
Will we collect, or Peter, what was the plan now?
Let's move in a dialogical manner. So the question and the answer.
Yeah.
So
I'm not entirely sure what you are referring to with the ice age, but as far as I know, the climatologists are saying that the world is heating up extremely dangerously, and if we don't stop this heating up, it will end in a catastrophe for the human species, at least. That's at least the climatologist that I have read, that this is the outcome. So it's very similar to coronavirus, that it's going to have a very stark health effect on our species, and therefore actions are needed.
But maybe Lembit, you would like to specify your question a little bit, because maybe...
What I meant is that as an ice age is defined by the status that we have polar ice, and this is not for the most of the world's existence, is this not the the normal state. For like if we take 90% or more than 90% of the time that we have had this Earth, it has not had a polar ice caps. So understanding that our climatologists saying that human activity is sort of helping towards ending this ice age, I understand that human action there is not a desirable view, but what says that the having the polar ice caps is something that is desirable?
Okay, maybe I can kind of like put forth a sort of twist in the argument, in the sense that historically, the climate change is not even probably close to be the worst the planet has had, or the most rapid. There have been way larger climate changes in the geological history of planet Earth. That's definitely true. But what makes it a wicked problem is not the climate change itself, but maintaining the way of life as we know it in view of it, which becomes ever more impossible given this change that is going on. If you call it ice age, yes, it could be, but then the issue is not sustaining, not necessarily ice age from a geological historical point of view, but the view of our societal situation. So something along these lines. Maybe you, Ben, want to add something?
No, not really. Just as far as I want to believe the climate specialists who say that the Earth will become basically, if not inhabitable for us, then there will be huge natural disasters that dealing with will, destroy our society, and many lives will be lost. So I'm starting from that assumption. And
yeah.
I also don't want to actually discuss this issue, whether this is true or not.
So the wickedness is not the climate change itself, but our relation to it in the current, let's say, global, I don't know, globalized society kind of sense. Okay, I see hands raised now. First, I think was Jonathan, then Naval, and then Leif. So Jonathan, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you to all three of you for the presentation. I have a question more aimed at Benjamin, but I guess because I was inspired by his presentation, but anyone can answer this. I'm interested in perhaps some more reflections on the role of experts in the governance of wicked problems or failure governance, maybe more concretely in the situation of COVID-19, because my thoughts were first that, okay, so how, when a crisis begins, how do we tell who the experts are and from what field? Because when we take COVID-19, something that I have noticed very much, where there is a lot of rhetoric. Some governments have done this more than others, who kind of given up their decision-making power to the experts, or they pretty much present themselves as simply, following the science. And what happened, especially in the United States, was that a lot of the experts who were involved in the crisis response, especially epidemiologists, who took models that, well, let's say they had to be simplified in times where you needed, especially in such a wicked problem, there is this need to act very quickly. But a lot of the models kind of assume that there were no differentiations in the population, that everyone could have this disease, is like this one abstract individual. And now a lot of the data we have, especially in the United States, is that how COVID-19 impacts certain populations a lot differently, especially the African American community, or it impacts differently based on class, gender, all kinds of categories. So now there's been a lot of criticism that those we've considered experts only in this very, from epidemiology, but a lot of social scientists who predicted this very early were completely ignored. So if we say that we need to always involve experts in this as well, but this field of experts is also very diverse. So maybe a few reflections on this issue of the role of experts. Thank you.
I would quickly, I was very, I think most of us here are probably social scientists that are listening, so they like what you're saying, that we should have some social scientists in the expert committees, because we would have probably talked about this, where the natural scientists just see every human kind of as equal, or as, part of the model, as you said very nicely. In the German case, by the way, it took a very long time till anything happened, because there were no real experts, or the infrastructure was not in place. It took nearly 2 months from Germany acknowledging it till having decisions in place, because there were no experience in dealing with a pandemic. In the Taiwan example, it was day one. They had all the infrastructure also from the previous pandemics. So there's something there, I think. But my colleagues, maybe something more.
Yeah, I can point out that in Estonia, for instance, it was like a couple of months ago when they decided to involve one psychologist among the research council, scientific research council, and I remember the part of the opposition, especially Social Democrats, actually pointed out that there is a need for social scientists too. But mostly it was, yes, as we know, that the medical experts, by and large, epidemiologists, and it seems to be quite the case in most Western countries, as far as I know. And the thing is that wicked problems are not a notion for natural sciences. They are essentially, I would say, social science concepts. Even though the models that that sometimes are deployed are borrowed from natural sciences and so on. But maybe Georg would like to add something too. No?
I have questions only, because if we look at the action of government, I am very asking about whether we can explain the difference in COVID management capacity when we are looking US and, for instance, Vietnam or Korea or Japan. I think that this question to Jonathan, we are too much relying to expertise. You know very much about Bruno Latour and John Law, what they are saying about how we can meet such kind of events when social networks and natural networks are starting to intermingle, and then regulative capacity, self-regulative capacity is at least the same importance in the managing of COVID crisis. Today in Estonia, for instance, our government is trying to manage, but they cannot manage, because I think that is something different in mindset and in cultural background. Of if we can speak, and I emphasize the different cultures of process cultures of Chinese and I mean human dominated and human centered understanding, self-actional understanding of policy in Europe, and this is also cause of climate crisis. We try to solve it, not to adapt to it, and therefore we cannot manage it.
Mm-hmm. Okay, now Naval, you had your hand raised.
Yes, thank you for your presentations. I sort of have a clarification question on the conceptualization of wicked problems. So I'm sorry if I didn't keep up, but the way that it seems to appear is that there's a conceptual overlap between wicked problems as being problems that we have disagreements in defining, and an overlap in terms of wicked problems where we do have an agreement to the extent that an expert could be identified, but the solution being disagreed upon. So for instance, let me just explain what I mean. With the cases that you've presented with COVID and climate change, there is, at least in theory, a scientific solution and a scientific description of the problem out there, i.e. the world is heating up or COVID is a deadly disease that kills people, according to science. But the solution of governing these problems is undefined. So it appears as a complex problem, whereas the issue of, for instance, refugees from a fallout from like a nuclear ecological disaster, for instance, what happened in Chernobyl, and how we categorize them as ecological refugees, or whether we categorize them as migrants, or the lack of defining who those people are, for instance, would be a wicked problem. So I'm just wondering whether wicked problems are conceptually can and cannot be defined, and to what extent do definable wicked problems turn into complex problems instead?
Okay, when it comes to climate change, the agreement you probably referred to is the overwhelming majority agreement among scientists, but they are not the only stakeholders, not even the major stakeholders in this particular issue, and political stakeholders all over the world. Half of the United States voters would probably not agree on the definition of climate change problem. This is a very important political tool for divisions. So the wickedness comes at least partly from there, if not mostly. So in that sense, I wouldn't agree that there's an agreement among stakeholders about the definition of climate change problem or governing problem. And yes, and you mentioned the refugee issue is I would say, even more straightforward. Who are they? What is the crisis? And we could even add here the political, economic, and whatever aspects. So that would be my response. Maybe somebody would like to add something, or Navalju maybe would like to respond something.
Okay, thank you so much. But it just appears as a distinction between experts and non-experts. So it sort of like reflects Jonathan's sort of question in terms of if we can identify a potential expert to rely on for a wicked problem, doesn't that necessarily change the framings of the problem? I.e., we listen to scientists with climate change, we already prioritize their conception of the issue as the defining feature of the problem, as opposed to a political conception of climate change to be the defining feature of climate change. So in that context, that's pretty much.
Yeah. Basically, I would say that when it comes to political problems, the line drawing is very, very problematic indeed, especially in democratic systems where citizens are supposed to have a voice and even vote, of course. But when it comes to the COVID examples, the issue is why were the members of the task force in the government of Taiwan listened to and at the same time, in the Trump administration in the US, they were basically not listened to for months and months, crucial months, when the exponential expansion would have been, there was a possibility to avoid this expansion. This needs to have some further study. By the way, there are sources and links even discovered that Trump actually knew the seriousness of the problem already in the very beginning of January. But you know, election year, economic rise of biggest in history, as he always refers to it. So the question needs to further scrutinization, and so if you are an expert, this doesn't mean that you are heard or you have some authoritative position to define the political problem automatically. But in some places it seems to be working way more, like in Taiwan and maybe in Germany, compared to others, like in Trump America, at least.
You also, if you are the expert, you oftentimes also don't know what to do still. You just might have a better idea to which direction to go, and then say this is not working and let's move some other way.
Can I make a small remark? We are finalizing our textbook on policy making and policy analysis. Leif, I see, we are co-editors. And one of the chapters is devoted to the experts. And this analysis is focused, or main argument is that experts are actually often most partial actors in the policy decision making. And if you cannot balance experts, you can receive so-called war of reports and political decisions. Thank you.
And that's always the trouble. Okay, but I give word to other people as well. So Leif was next in our list of questions.
Hello. Thank you for the complex presentations. They were really interesting. And somehow I will continue the current line of questions from a different angle. This transactionalist approach seems to require or presume some willingness of the actors to be related to the problem in a, let's say, constructive way or constitutive way. But we know there are several actors who actually benefit from non-cooperative or even non-problem related positions, be they politicians who gain by promoting maybe very alternative approaches, be they some companies who benefit or some other actors who economically benefit. So it seems there is somehow an inherent lack of motivation to engage in solving or tackling problems, mediating problems. Have you thought about it, and do you have some way to reconcile it with your framework? Maybe it's for Peter mostly, but others can also comment.
Yeah, we can, of course, this is the perennial trouble with social and political sciences, that even if we point out a way out of the impasse, who would listen to us, but basically what you are saying is what we refer to as self-active, deproblematization, and we can put a conceptual framework for making sense of different activities that have been done under this by and large umbrella concept. But yes, we actually, besides, for instance, climate change, in the concluding chapter, plan to reflect on the very issue of social science education as well. So what would it mean to study or teach social sciences, in a sense that to be, you know, that would be more liable to this transactive or transactional thinking rather than, you know, the self-active stuff. But I don't see good answers to those questions now. But conceptually, yes, definitely what you described is, we have this frame for categorizing this kind of issues.
So basically, it's just the question of different strategies, be they then self, inter, or transactive, and you can just seek to convince the transactive strategy is better.
Yeah, that's actually related to the issue of you know, how to convince. Usually these are like scholars are invited to, I don't know, government departments. So let's have a schooling day or something like that, or let's send our member of the department to a certain lecture. But the thing is that to school people to think about wicked problems always needs to go like collectively. Like you cannot just go send one guy there who comes back with the knowledge. Now we know how to solve wicked problems. This is closer to conversion rather than persuasion, that you think differently at some point, and it comes through practice and education. But no, there's no king's pathway to that, I guess. So others, would you like to add something on that? Oh.
No.
There is a very elaborated method of critical dialogue, which is treating the hostile and irreconcilable differences between actors. And the thing Leif is telling is the maybe main thing, to pick people up from the selfish world, understanding of world, and to start to listen each other. And for that, because of lack of that capacity, very many policies are failing. And then the dominant position is taking over.
That's why I think the concept of, let's say, just ongoing problem situation that is managed is somewhat more promising than just speaking of one problem. Problem indicates it's still something very specific, even if it's unsolvable in a direct way. But somehow it seems there will be different actors with different strategies, and this is just an ongoing work then to find these more, let's say, cooperative or transactive ways forward.
Yeah, definitely. Those words matter. Yes, problem seems to be a thing rather than process referring. Yeah. Definitely. Okay, I will give floor to Tõnis now. Your hand is up.
Oh, yes, hello. It was quite impressive what you have already done, and it was a great pleasure to follow your presentations. But now, to put it very briefly, what about democracy? So if you take democracy, whether it really matters for the governance failure or governance failure theory and
failure governance.
Yes, sorry. and whether you consider democracy as a concept at the deeper level, or it's just a background variable or a framing factor or something like this. So what about democracy?
Yeah, that's a very important question. And actually, in a way, in a previous book already, we discussed this explicitly. Actually, if we define democracy as a form of life or form of communication, form of discourse, basically a form of culture, then we would even say that the essence or core of democracy is problematization, actually. The main democratic institutions are there to problematize power, basically. And that's actually, we try to take into account that even if you could put it in a provocative way, that democracy is a regime of a failure of power to fully constitute itself. There's always something hindering this, and that's a very important thing. And yes, those mechanisms like voting are secondary to the concept of democracy. There are various very important issues of democratic governance. And for me, at least, it has been quite elementary that problematization is also democratization. But as we all know, over problematization can actually lead to destruction too. When the code of our organization is broken, we always problematize it. Then what is left often is is pure chaos or pure fear itself, and that's often also an issue of the emergence of kind of authoritarian discourse. But democracy is definitely biased towards problematization rather than deproblematization.
Okay, maybe thank you very much. Mm-hmm.
Dennis, maybe you ask about democratic institutions current, how they fit to the situation when there is a permanent governance failure. And
yes,
you need
yes,
governing.
to some extent,
not,
yeah. Mm-hmm.
Okay, not via hierarchies, but you should govern this contingency. And at the same time, what COVID, for instance, you should find the balance of actual self-responsibility of people and expert advice and politicians. And this is a kind of, I agree with you that Eastern classical model is not currently working. We have to revise it and to find appropriate. So, and this presumes that we should depart from the man-dominated, dominant position or self-actional position in policy making. But this is my understanding.
Mm. And it also affects how we are conceptualizing democracy at the very same time. Yes.
Yeah. We definitely conceptualize it in terms of meaning-making culture, communication, not formal constitutional institutions, but a practice, basically, transaction. Okay, but it seems we are a little bit already over time. Thank you very much, everyone, for coming, for these interesting questions and comments. And well, I'm just mentioning that our next research seminar is also in a couple of weeks on March 3rd, where Dr. Birgit Poopu will give her presentation. And again, see you soon, and thanks again.